All right, so first off, how many of you have seen the movie The Matrix? Hands up if you have. Okay, so quite a few of you, not everyone. So let me bring those of you who haven't up to speed. It's a bit of a spoiler, so sorry about that. So in this movie, the world has been taken over by robots, right? And there are still humans in this world. It's not like the Terminator where the robot's trying to kill all the humans. The humans are very useful to the robots. They use the humans as batteries, essentially, to power themselves. And the humans, I guess fortunately for them, are totally unaware that this is going on. And the reason they're totally unaware is because of this machine called the Matrix. So basically what the Matrix does is it stimulates their brains so that they're having experiences that they can't tell apart from ordinary experiences like we think we're having right now. So by ordinary experiences, I mean sort of sensory experiences, like visual experiences, experiences involving hearing things, tasting things, so on and so forth, that normally emerge from interacting with our environments. Right? So that's what I mean by ordinary experiences. And the beauty of the Matrix, at least from the robot's perspective, is that it gives humans these experiences that they can't tell apart from the ordinary ones. So they're not in a position to uprise or whatever. So that's the scenario I want you to fix in your mind. And I think once you start to dwell on it, it gets a little bit scary. And here's why. So the characters in the movie can't tell that they're in the Matrix, right? They can't know whether or not they're in the Matrix. It doesn't seem to them that they are. If that's right, then how can we know that we're not in the Matrix? Right? On the face of it, at least, it seems like what it would be like to be in the Matrix is exactly what it's like for us now. And if that's right, it seems like we can't tell ordinary experiences apart from Matrix ones. And then we're not in a position to know that we're not in the Matrix. Right? This is scary. Like, it's not going to make a difference to the way we live our lives, but it's a sort of troubling thought. How can we tell that we're not in the Matrix? So here's the plan for the rest of this talk. I think that the worry that I just outlined of how we could possibly know that we're not in the Matrix gets its grip on us only given two long-standing assumptions about the nature of our experiences and the way we get knowledge about our experiences. So I'm going to explain what these assumptions are, and then I'm going to explain how it's possible to reject these assumptions, despite conventional wisdom to the contrary. And then I'm going to give you the payoff. So the payoff is that if we reject these assumptions, we can get knowledge that we're not in the Matrix after all. Okay, so on to the assumptions. This guy is the famous philosopher René Descartes. Right? You might have heard of him before. I think, therefore I am. That's this guy. He's up here because arguably he's one main reason why the two assumptions I'm about to explain have as much credibility as they do in contemporary philosophy. So he has a certain kind of picture of experiences and how we get knowledge of them that we've sort of inherited from him and play a big role in generating the worry that I've just described to you. Of course, he didn't put it in terms of the Matrix, but... All right, so the first assumption is that what it's like to have an experience is something that's entirely down to what's going on in our heads. So what do I mean by what it's like to have an experience? I mean roughly something like its feel, right? So there's a certain kind of feel that goes with experiencing redness, right? It's different. So an experience of redness feels different from just closing your eyes and believing that there's something red. There's some difference in feel there, right? There's a difference in feel between experiencing redness and experiencing yellowness, right? So there's something it's like to have these different kinds of experiences, and we can roughly sort of gesture at it by talking about, well, they just feel different. And what this assumption says is, okay, where does that feeling come from? What's going on? Well, it's down to something going on in our heads, presumably our brains. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption that traces at least as far back as Descartes is that we can have knowledge about our experiences in the Matrix. So the idea behind this assumption is that the way that we get knowledge about our sensory experiences is in, by some sense, looking within, right? So how do I know that I'm having an experience of a gray rectangle right now? Well, all I have to do is turn my attention inward And then it's just obvious to me. I'm having an experience of a gray rectangle, and that experience has the feel that's associated with experiences of grayness and rectangles. So that's the basic idea. And then you say, well, look, the poor souls that are stuck in the matrix, they can at least do that, right? They can't attend to what's going on outside of them in their environments, right? Because they're perceptually completely disconnected from what's going on in their environments. So they can't turn their attention outwards, but at least they can they can direct their attention inwards to their experiences, right? So they could at least know that they're having experience of a gray rectangle, right? Even if they can't know whether or not there's a gray rectangle actually in front of them. So the thought is, if we get knowledge about our experiences by turning our attention inward in some way, then we can have knowledge of our experiences even if we were poor souls in the matrix. Okay, so those are the two assumptions that trace back to Descartes and play a large role in generating the worry that I previously outlined about whether or not we can know we're not in the matrix. Okay, so here's the big picture of what I'm going to do. So if you pay super close attention to anything I say, pay super close attention to this, right? Because it'll make it a lot easier to follow what comes after this. All right, so here's the big picture. So the first assumption, recall, was that what it's like to have an experience is something entirely down to goings-on in our head, right? For reasons that I'm going to explain in a minute, most philosophers think that denying that is totally absurd, right? We just can't do it. It leads to absurd implications. So that's what most philosophers think. And I say, well, that's true. It's absurd, but only if we accept the second assumption, the assumption that we could have knowledge of our experiences from within the matrix. So if we really wanted to deny one, we could avoid absurdity by rejecting the second assumption, right? We can avoid absurdity by denying both 1 and 2. That is a coherent package. And it's a package that I think recommends itself because if we deny one in the way that I'm about to suggest, we're going to have a way of knowing that we're not in the matrix. Right? So that's the big picture. Now I'm going to make good on the details. All right, so let's start with denying one. So remember that one said that what it's like to have an experience is entirely in our heads. I hold a different view. I think that what it's like to have an experience is at least partly a matter of things that are going on outside our heads. So here's my alternative. What it's like to have an experience consists in perceiving things in one's environment. So take the example of experiencing yellowness, what it's like to experience yellowness. Where does that come from? Well, part of it has to do with goings-on in my brain. I think also part of that feel comes from perceiving that instance of yellowness before me in my environment. Right? That's an alternative picture of what it's like to have an experience consists in. Okay. Now, I don't have the time to explain to you why I like this particular view of what it's like to have an experience. That would take us too far afield. But what's important for our purposes in this context is why people think that my alternative is totally crazy. So here's why they think it's totally crazy. Here's an apparent problem, and the apparentness is signified by the question mark. I don't really think it's a problem in the end. But here's the idea. Since matrix experiences don't involve perceiving things in one's environment, the view that I've just outlined is going to entail that there's nothing it's like to have a matrix experience. So why is this? Well, remember, subjects in matrix experiences, or subjects of matrix experiences, don't perceive anything in their environment, right? They're completely cut off, right? Now, in the view that I just proposed, in order for there to be something it's like for you to have an experience, you need to be perceiving something in your environment, right? And since the subjects of matrix experiences aren't doing that, it follows that there's nothing it's like to have a matrix experience. Now, a lot of people say, that's totally crazy. Why? Well, like I said at the beginning, subjects of matrix experiences cannot tell their experiences apart from ordinary ones. And you might say, well, surely that's because what it's like to have a matrix experience is exactly the same as what it's like to have an ordinary experience, which means there's got to be something it's like to have a matrix experience. Okay, so that's why people think that the sort of view that I've articulated and favor is totally bonkers, right? Because it means that there's nothing it's like to be in the matrix, essentially. And people say, well, surely there's got to be something it's like. Otherwise, they would be able to tell their experiences apart from ordinary ones. So that's the problem. But I don't think it's a problem if we deny the second assumption that I explained earlier. Right? So this was the assumption that we can have knowledge about our experiences in the matrix. So what was sort of underlying this assumption was the idea that the way that we get knowledge about our experiences is by looking inward. But is that really right? I invite you to agree with me that no, it's not right. So suppose I were to ask you about the experience you're having and what it's like for you to have it. What would you do? Would you turn your attention inwards? I mean, that's not what I do. I turn my attention outwards to the things in my environment that I'm perceiving. So if you ask me, hey, Heather, what's your experience like? I'm going to look out in front of me and say, well, I'm having an experience of a gray rectangle. That's how I know what I'm experiencing. I turn my attention not inwards, but I turn it outwards. So here's an alternative model, right? So we can reject two and say, no, you can't have knowledge about your experience in the matrix because the way that we get knowledge about our experiences is by attending to what we perceive in our environments. That just seems really apt as a description of what we do when we're trying to get knowledge about our own experiences and tell other people about them. Okay, so notice a consequence of this account, this alternative to assumption 2. Since matrix experiences don't involve perceiving things in one's environment, our way of knowing about our experiences couldn't work properly in the matrix. Why is this? Well, remember, again, the subjects of matrix experiences don't perceive anything in their environments. So when they try to do what they're supposed to do in order to get knowledge of their experiences, they just can't do it, right? Because there's nothing that they're perceiving for them to attend to, right? There's a certain procedure that we follow in getting knowledge about our experiences, and the people in the matrix just can't carry it out, right? So this whole procedure of getting knowledge about your experience wouldn't work properly in the matrix. And I think this leads to an interesting result, right? So, of course, a subject in the matrix would, believe that there's something it's like for them. But what I'd like to suggest is that that's a false belief, right? So when your way of knowing about something isn't working properly, it's not going to give you knowledge, right? Unless you're like accidentally lucky or something like that. When your way of getting knowledge about something isn't working properly, what it throws up at the end of the day are false beliefs, right? So the idea here is that the subjects in the matrix will have all sorts of false beliefs about their experience, including that there's something it's like to be having it. All right, so let's put all of that together and see how we can get a favorable answer to the question that I started with. All right, so if we deny the second assumption, it's not going to be absurd to deny the first one, right? So we say that matrix experiences can't be told apart from ordinary ones, but not because what it's like to have them is the same. Rather, on my picture, denying 2, the reason that matrix experiences can't be told apart from ordinary ones is that the matrix subject's way of knowing about their experiences isn't working properly, and so it gives them the false belief that there's something it's like to have the experience, when actually there's nothing it's like for them at all. So that's why we can hold on to 1. We can deny 1 in the way I suggested. We just have to deny 2 as well, which I think is an independently plausible thing to do. All right, and here's the real payoff. Here's why we should be wanting to deny 1. If we do so, we can know that we're not in the matrix. So remember the way that I denied 1. I said, what it's like to have an experience is a matter, at least partly, of perceiving things in your environment. Right? So that means that only ordinary experiences have a feel to them. And if that's right, now we've got a tip-off that we're having an ordinary experience. Right? That's a sign that I'm having an ordinary experience. All I have to do in order to know that I'm not in the matrix is to know that I'm having an ordinary experience with a feel, right? Which is something I can just straightforwardly do by looking out into my environment and attending to the things that I perceive. So in the last 15 seconds or so, I'm going to address a concern that perhaps if you followed me this far, many of you have. You might say, Heather, this is not going to get me knowledge that I'm not in the matrix, because I'd believe all of these things if I were in the matrix. Right? So how can I rule out that I'm not in that bad scenario? So I don't have the time to do justice to this worry right now. I'm happy to talk more about it with you afterwards if you can stick around. But here's the basic idea. I think what that worry boils down to is a demand for something totally impossible. Right? What it boils down to is, Heather, give me a way to step outside of my experience and compare it with the world to see whether it matches. But that's impossible. Experiences aren't the kinds of things limited creatures like us can step outside of, right? They're the way we access the world. Only God can look at our experiences and compare them with the world to see whether they match. So that's what you want as an answer to the question, how do we know we're not in the matrix? I can't give it to you. What I take myself to have done is given you at least one version of the best that we can do. So thank you.